These Violent Delights, Chapter 25. So, Roma said, may I warn you not to report back your findings about this facility? They were waiting now on the first floor, seated upon the metal chairs, scattered along the far wall. At some point they needed to get rid of the corpse that lay in front of them, but for now it remained, its scrunched, anxious face frozen in death, while Lawrence poured the vaccine into little test tubes, squeezing various chemicals into some and placing others into the rumbling machines he had on the second floor, humming under his breath while he worked above them. As if your feeble warning would work, Juliet replied. You should know that by now. Roma slumped in his seat, his head lolling against the backrest. Should I have blindfolded you? Juliet scoffed. She tapped her shoes rapidly, twisting the heel left and right like the windshield wipers, while her eyes did the same, darting from sight to sight. Even if I wanted to play spy, she said, this information would be useless. She had a particularly sharp silver thing coming down overhead like an icicle. It descended from a machine hanging where the ceiling of the first floor meshed into the railing of the second floor. Useless? Roma echoed in disbelief. His sharp tone drew the attention of his two friends, who had otherwise been staring off into space, seated on chairs along the perpendicular wall. Deemed unnecessary, Juliet corrected. She wasn't quite sure why she was carrying on this conversation. It wasn't as if she owed him an explanation, and yet, all the same, it didn't seem like it would hurt to explain. The Scarlet Gang remains in the age of traditional herbs. Perhaps one or two metal machines. We are nowhere near... She waved her hands around. This. Her parents would not care about these findings if she ran back with them, if she could even get their attention for a short minute. They would rather ask why she had been in a White Flower facility and hadn't thought to burn it down. Roma folded his arms. Interesting. Juliet narrowed her eyes. Now, are you going to report that information back? Why would I? Roma had a sly sort of smile playing on his lips, one that he wasn't letting slip out completely. We already knew that. Juliet stamped her foot down on a fit of feigned anger, but Roma was too quick. He moved his toes away, and all Juliet achieved was a shock rocketing up her ankle. Her ankle throbbed. A genuine snort of amusement slipped out. It was an acknowledgement that she had been bested in a small matter, that she had fallen back on her old petty tricks and forgotten that Roma knew these well. Can't do that, Roma said. Else you have to step on me in return, Juliet finished. At once their smiles faded. At once they were remembering the times when Juliet had giggled at Roma's superstition, the times when he would have her hold still after she had stomped on his foot and gently, ever so gently, stepped on her toes too. We will be fated to have an argument if I do not return the gesture, Roma had chided it the first time upon Juliet's confusion. Hey, stop laughing. He had laughed too. He had laughed because the idea of an argument driving them apart had seemed so absurd when they were fighting the forces of their families to be together. Look where they were now, separated by a mile of bloodshed. Juliet turned away. They lapsed back into silence, allowing the humming of the machines to roar and ebb as it pleased. Occasionally, Juliet heard a rare hoot from outside, and she would angle her head whichever way the noise came from, trying to figure out if it was an owl or a dog or the monster on the streets of Shanghai. Finally, Juliet couldn't stand her boredom. She stood and started to wander about the lab, picking things up at random and setting them down after inspecting them. The beakers lined along the floor, the little metallic spoons gathered in the corners, the neatly organized files at the end of the work tables. A hand snatched the files away from under her nose. Those aren't for your prying eyes, lovely, Marshall said. Juliet frowned. I wasn't prying, she countered, and if I were, you would not have been able to tell. Is that so? Marshall set the files down and shuffled them away from her. She resented the action. She was putting her own neck on the line to work with Roma. In what world would she take that risk to be a double-crosser? Marshall, sit back down, Roma called from across the room. Benedict Montagov did not even bother looking up from the sketch pad he had retrieved from his bag. Lawrence, on the other hand, cast a worried glance from the second floor. If the direction of his gaze was any indication, he was not afraid of a brawl starting, but rather that any rough nonsense could damage the glass beakers around the labs. Why don't I show you some of my inventions? Lawrence tried, his voice a loud bellow. They may be the most innovative materials that Shanghai has yet to see. Neither Juliet nor Marshall paid him any heed. Juliet took a step in. Marshall matched her. Are you insinuating something? Juliet asked. Not just insinuating. Marshall grabbed her wrist. He pulled it out toward him, then reached for the hem of her sleeve, where he yanked out the blade she had hidden. I'm accusing. Why did you bring weapons, Miss Kai? Juliet made a noise of disbelief. She caught Marshall's other wrist with the hand she had freed and twisted. It would be stranger if I didn't bring weapons, you— Ow! He hit her. To be fair, it had certainly been an instinct, a jerk of his elbow, a reaction to the pressure she was applying to his arm, but Juliet staggered back, her chin smarting from the blow of bone against bone. From his seat, Roma bolted up and shouted, Mars! But Juliet was already pushing Marshall back, her throbbing jaw giving way to anger, and her anger intensifying, the pulsating pain making its way to her lip. This was the way of the blood feud. A small infraction and then a return without thinking, furious jabs and fast hits moving before the mind could register. No reason, only impulse. Marshall grabbed a hold of Juliet's arm again, this time twisting it hard until her whole limb was folded against her back. The fight could have ended there, but Marshall still had her knife in his hand, and Juliet's first instinct was to fear. Temporary peace or not, she had no reason to trust him. She had every reason to kick a foot against the nearby work table and propel herself upward until she was using the tight grip Marshall had on her arm to roll over his shoulder, spinning over him and landing with a solid thump on her 2 feet. The maneuver applied enough pressure on Marshall's arm that he was sent hurtling to the floor, his skull thumping to the linoleum with a grunt as he lost his balance from her brutal yank. Quickly, Juliet swooped for the knife he had dropped. In that moment, she didn't know if she even intended to kill him. All she knew was that she did not think when she fought. She only knew enemy from friend. She only knew to keep moving, to bring the knife up to the same motion she had retrieved it, raise it high until it caught the light, only moments away from an arc that would end with it buried in Marshall Seo's chest. Until Marshall started laughing. That sounded alone. It tore her out from her haze. It stopped Juliet in her tracks, the knife loosening in her grip, the tension in her arms collapsing. By the time Roma and Benedict hurried near enough to stop the fight, Juliet was already extending a hand toward Marshall, pulling him back onto his feet. Phew! How long did it take you to practice that move? Marshall asked, dusting his shoulders off. He propped a shoe on the corner of the table, as Juliet had, and tested its weight. You were truly defying gravity for a second. You're too tall to pull it off, so don't try, Juliet replied. Roma and Benedict blinked. They had no words. Their faces said it all. Marshall lifted his head up, addressing Lawrence. Can we still see your inventions? Lawrence's mouth opened and closed. The animosity in the room had now given way entirely to curiosity, and it seemed the scientist didn't know what to do with it. Wordlessly, he could only leave his machines to rumble and trek down the stairs. He waved them down to the shelves near the back of the first floor, eyeing Juliet and Marshall, who followed him eagerly while Roma and Benedict trailed with more hesitation, watching the two like they were afraid this piece was merely part of a longer fight. These little knickknacks were not made with White Flower funds, and are unrelated to your gangster nonsense, so don't you go babbling to your father, Roma, Lawrence started. He picked up a jar of blue salts and popped it open. Take a sniff. Juliet leaned in. It smells good. Lawrence grinned to himself. The motion looked a little funny with the new bald patch at the center of his chin. It induces seizures in birds. I usually sprinkle it in the grassy area at the back of the building. He moved on to a gray powder, bringing it down for Marshall to see. Marshall passed it to Benedict, who passed it to Roma, who passed it back. Between the latter two, they hadn't collectively looked at the jar for more than a second. This creates a sudden quick explosion of air when mixed with water, Lawrence explained, then came back into his hands. I usually throw it into the Huangpu River when I'm having a stroll, and the birds are trying to waddle along with me. It scares them off rather well. I'm starting to pick up a pattern, Juliet said. Lawrence pulled a face, his elderly features sagging low. Birds, he muttered. Miniature little devils. Juliet tried not to laugh. Scanning through more of the labels of the shelf, Her Dutch was mostly conversational, so it was difficult to comprehend what each jar was tagged as. When her inspection snagged on a small jar in the back, she wasn't sure what had been the cause of her interest. That Dudeskus was printed along the side, or that it was the most opaque, white liquid she had ever seen. It reminded her of the whites of her eyes, unimpenetrable, solid. "What's that one?" Juliet asked, pointing. "Oh, that one is new." Lawrence practically rose onto his tiptoes in excitement as he stretched to retrieve it. With the jar nestled in his palm, the scientist handled it with special care, slowly easing off the lid. Juliet caught a whiff of what smelled like a garden of roses. It was sweet and fragrant, and it reminded her of bygone days running around in the backyard with dirt in her hands. "It is able to stop an organism's heart," Lawrence explained reverently. "I've not perfected it quite yet, but indigestion of this substance should create a state that appears like death for 3 hours. When it wears off," he clicked his fingers. The sound lagged, a result of his stiff, aging joints. "The organism awakes, like it was never dead." In that moment, a loud ding echoed through the lab, and Lawrence exclaimed that the machine was done, returning the jar to its original spot and hurrying up the steps back to his work table. Roma and Benedict were quick to follow on his heels, examining their hypotheses over what he would find. Juliet, meanwhile, reached a hand into the shelf. Before Lawrence could peer over and see, her palm swallowed the jar of unimpenetrable white material, and she shook it into her sleeve. She had been fast enough to evade Lawrence's eyes, but not fast enough to evade Marshall's. Juliet looked right at him and dared him to say something. Marshall only quirked his lip and turned, hurrying after the others. It seemed fitting that he could feel slighted when she was peeping through their lab reports, but this would amuse him. "Let us see," Lawrence was saying when Juliet finally joined them. He lifted the lid to a machine and extracted a strip of thin paper with black lines running from length to length, making a sound under his breath that Juliet couldn't quite interpret. Lawrence then pushed past her to another machine, checking the dark screen on this one and looking at the strip of paper again. When he was done, his final stop was the books on his desk. "Well," Lawrence finally said after he had browsed through his books and kept everyone simmering in complete silence for 5 minutes. He stopped his finger at the bottom of a yellowed page, tapping twice on a list of formulae that he had printed out by hand, as if that meant anything. "With our limited starting point, I cannot conclude whether this is a true vaccine like they say. I have nothing to compare it against." Lawrence squinted at the paper again. "But it is indeed a mixture of some use. The primary substance is an opiate, one that I believe has been introduced to the streets here, something called Lernocrom." Juliet stopped cold. She felt a tremor shake down her spine. A revolution dropped straight from the heavens and onto her shoulders. "Taimade," she cursed softly. "I know that drug." "Well, we have both started dealing it, albeit sparsely," Roma said, recognizing the name too. "No, that's not it," Juliet said tiredly. "Lernocrom. It's the drug that Walter Dexter was trying to sell to the Scarlet Gang in bulk." She closed her eyes, then opened them again. "He's the Larkspur's supplier."